Fire on the Mountain, Chapter 1, Part 4. 2 hours later, they were in Charlestown. Yasmin turned east at the courthouse toward Harper's Ferry. The road ran straight between well-kept farms, some still private. The wheat was still waiting for the international combine teams working their way north from Nova Africa, but a few local hydrogen-powered corn pickers were out, their unmuffled internal combustion engines rattling and snorting. Yasmin saw a green-gabled house at least 100 years old and started to point it out to Harriet, thinking it was the very one in the story in the doctor's bag in the back seat. Green Gables. But no, hadn't that one burned? Besides, Harriet was asleep. The shoes did look plain. There was something you were supposed to do with living shoes, to train them, but Yasmin couldn't remember what it was. She sighed. Her reunion with her daughter was not off to a very good start. Oh well, things could only get better. Ahead, the blue ridge, blue only from the east, was red and gold. Neatly tucked under it, at the gap, was Harper's Ferry, where the Independence War began. By noon, I had unloaded the fence post while Deal dickered and spat in Low German with the owner, and we started back with the new horse tied to the wagon. He was indeed a skittery character. His name was Caesar, which I spelled in my mind Seize Her, for I had not yet formed that acquaintance with the classics which was to enrich my later years, and will, I hope, yours as well, great-grandson. The owner, a breakaway Amish, said he had bought the house lamed from 2 Tidewater gentlemen passing through. It made a Southern horse nervous, he joked, to live so close to the Mason-Dixon line, which ran, he said, at the very bottom of the field in which we stood. He pointed out the fence row. Sees her munched hay out of the wagon bed as we headed back south, and Deal unwrapped the sausage biscuits Mama had sent with us. Deal was stingy with words, but he shared a pull of cider from the jug he kept under the seat. He was no respecter of youth in the matter of drink, but who was in those days? I lay out in the back of the wagon with my head under the seat out of the sun and went to sleep. Deal went to sleep driving, and unless I miss my guess, Kate went to sleep pulling, which mules can do. I was dreaming of soldiers, perhaps influenced by the little band I'd seen before dawn. Or perhaps my second wife was right when she said I had the second sight, or perhaps the Amish was right and Seize Her smelled abolution. Certainly, he was to live the rest of his life surrounded by the smell. The horse woke me up, whickering nervously. I sat up and heard popping that I thought at first was 4th of July firecrackers. We were on the Maryland side of the Potomac, near Sandy Hook. The railroad bridge to the west was burning, or at least smoking mightily. A train was stopped on the Virginia side, leaking steam, and men with rifles were swarming all over it. Every once in a while, one of them let off a shot towards the sky. A soldier watching from the riverbank rode into town with us. Deal didn't waste words asking what had happened, because he knew we'd be told with no prompting. The town had been attacked by an army of 100 abolitionists, the soldier said. He'd been sent with a detachment from Charlestown to guard the railroad bridge, but too late. The mayor, who was pretty universally liked, was dead, and so was a free black man named Hayward, who worked for the railroad. The soldier thought it was a great irony that a free nigger had been shot, since the attackers were Abs. The papers were to make much of this also, but since almost half the population of the ferry was Norafrican, and almost half of that free, or what passed for free in those days, I don't know how it could have been otherwise. George Washington's grandson and a score of other Virginians had been killed, the soldier said. He had a chaw the size of a goiter and spat into the wagon straw, and I kept expecting Deal to straighten him out, but he didn't. Coming past the end of the railroad bridge, we saw that the tracks had been spiked and 2 of the bridge pilings knocked over by a blast. The railroad workers were standing around, looking either puzzled or disgusted, and one of them jointly joined us for a ride across the wagon bridge into town. He'd been drinking freely. He spat into the hay too, and said Deal said nothing. I remember watching him spit uncorrected and thinking, what's this world coming to? Caesar was tossing his head and whickering, but Kate was steady. In the town, the hotel and several other buildings were still smoldering. There was a wild, scary smoke smell. The smell of us in Virginia were to come in the next few years to recognize as the smell of war. There was no fighting, but armed men were all over the streets looking fierce, bored, and uneasy at the same time. I felt my black face shining provocatively and would not have hidden it, but damped its blackness down if I could. The railroad men and the soldier both said Kansas Brown was behind the raid, and if this name had deep significance. White folks made much of Brown, though I had never heard his name, nor had any of the slaves until that day, when he became more famous among us than Moses at one stroke, and not as Kansas or Osawatomie Brown, but as Shenandoah Brown. The railroad man told how the hotel had been torched, and in the confusion Brown and his men had retreated across the Shenandoah into the Lundin Heights, which is what we call the Blue Ridge there. They had fast-firing breech-loading Sharps rifles. Once in the laurel thickets, who would follow them? Not the Virginie militia, the soldier said, laughing. They're at the tavern, a-soaking their wounds in government whiskey. I will attempt no more dialect. The railroad man seemed to take the soldier's words for an insult, and sulked and spat, wordless from there on. The soldier's cut was not altogether true anyway, I found out later. 4 of the Virginias had been killed in the fighting before falling back, all upon one another. I felt a deep, harmonious excitement stealing over me, though I did not at that time truly understand the events or what they meant. Who did, Murican or Norafrican? Deal was in a hurry to get back to Charlestown, but he was a man of steady habits, and so we had to stop at the Shenandoah Tavern, as usual. I stayed with the wagon. I usually took the chance when Deal was in the tavern to poke around Harper's Ferry, but this day I felt I should stay with the track. I have noticed in my 60-some-odd years that in times of civil unrest, even the most timid acquire a sudden ability to steal. Caesar was still prancy and wickery, smelling abolition, or blood, or smoke, or whatever it was that agitated him. The steep and usually sleepy streets of Harper's Ferry were filled, and everybody seemed confused. Stranded train passengers were wandering around with slaves dragging their luggage behind them. I got off the wagon once, just to stretch, and a man with a Carolina accent tried to hand me his carpet bag to carry. After that, I stayed glued to the wagon seat. Those deep South types thought every black face belonged to them. Sitting alone in the wagon, I was the only African in sight that wasn't hauling some white person's luggage around, and I felt several curious looks, as though I were to blame for all the smoke and ashes. I hadn't yet seen any blood. Perhaps it was my imagination, perhaps not. At first I shrank, then I sat up straight, experiencing fully for the first time that mingled sense of pride and terror that makes war such a favorite of men. I saw an Irish boy I knew, and hailed him, but he ran. I saw another boy I hardly knew and didn't like, and he stopped. He was black like me. This was my second lesson about war. It trues up the lines. The boy stopped at the wagon, and in a conspiratorial whisper told me that 200 Abs had tried to burn down the town and had shot the mayor dead. He sounded simultaneously shocked, scared, and boastful. 4 of the raiders were buried in a common grave down the river, he said. He tried to go down and see the bodies, but the soldiers were thicker than flies. They weren't really soldiers anyhow, just Virginias, he said, with leftover Hall's patterned muskets from the Mexican War. The Abs all had Kansas buffalo guns that would blow a man in half. Deal came out, and we headed home for Charlestown 6 miles across the valley. As usual, when he'd been at the tavern, Deal was more talkative, which meant that he said about 4 words a mile. But I learned from him that rumors were flying. The niggers had all run away. The niggers had all joined Brown. The niggers were coming down from the mountains as soon as dark fell, with spears as tall as church steeples. In fact, later that week, a wagon load of spears was found abandoned. End of part